My wife, Clarice, passed away on a Monday. It was sudden, a heart attack, the kind of final, brutal shock that leaves a hole in your life so big you don't know how to step around it. She had been my anchor for 50 years. The next day, Tuesday, her impossibly wealthy former employer, a man named Silas Thorne, called me at home. His voice, usually a smooth, commanding baritone, was sharp with urgency. "Robert, I found something important. Come to my manor immediately." Then he added a warning that chilled me to the bone. "Do not, under any circumstances, mention this to your son or his wife. They could put you in terrible danger." That call was a lightning bolt that split the sky of my grief. It suggested that Clarice hadn't just died of natural causes. She had been murdered, taken from me. But before I could rush to Silas's estate, I had to get through the most painful day of my life, the funeral. I needed to understand why the day of her farewell became the day my own son declared war on me. My name is Robert Kingston, and I'm 75 years old. I spent 4 decades working as a foreman, overseeing logistics at a massive depot, but before that I served my country, carrying a service rifle in a foreign war. I know how to read people, and I know the signs of impending disaster. Yet, nothing could have prepared me for the emotional storm that swaggered into St. Michael's Chapel that sticky Tuesday afternoon. I sat in the front row, staring at the polished oak casket that held Clarice, my dearest Clarice. We'd shared our lives for half a century. She was a small, vibrant woman with hands worn rough from honest work, but with a generous spirit that embraced everyone. For 30 years, she had been the chief housekeeper and personal steward to Silas Thorne, a financial mogul with more wealth than anyone could imagine. Silas trusted Clarice completely, making her the one person he relied on with his life and his most private affairs. The soft organ music created a mournful, low frequency that resonated painfully in my chest. The chapel was nearly full. Neighbors, members of the church choir, and even some of Mr. Thorne's domestic staff came to pay their respects. Everyone spoke in hushed, respectful whispers. Everyone, that is, except for the 2 people who should have been sitting right beside me. My son, Mark, and his wife, Sharon, were outrageously late. Not just 5 minutes late. They were 35 minutes late, walking in after the service had already begun. I didn't turn around, but I didn't have to. The heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary burst open, and I heard the obnoxious clack, clack, clack of Sharon's expensive, stiletto heels against the marble floor, a sound that echoed through the quiet space like a burst of gunfire. I could feel the entire congregation gasp and turn their heads. I kept my gaze locked on the beautiful arrangement atop Clarice's casket. White gardenias, her absolute favorite. Then, I smelled them before I saw them. A choking cloud of cheap, cloying designer fragrance that smelled like a cocktail of vanity, desperation, and stale cigarette smoke. Mark slid into the pew next to me. He was wearing a shockingly bright, ivory-colored linen suit that made him look like a character from a bad movie, certainly not a son attending his mother's funeral. He didn't offer a comforting touch to my shoulder, nor did he squeeze my hand. He didn't even glance at the casket. Instead, he immediately pulled out his cell phone. The screen illuminated his face in the dim light of the church, revealing his frantic, focused expression. He was texting someone. His thumbs flew across the glass, and his jaw was clenched tight. I glanced sideways and saw sweat glistening on his forehead. It wasn't the sweat of a grieving son. It was the cold perspiration of a man who felt trapped and cornered. Sharon pushed past him and squeezed in beside Mark. She was a young, aggressively stylish woman from a modest background who tried hard to project the image of someone born into a penthouse. She wore oversized black sunglasses indoors and a dress that was both far too short and far too tight for a funeral. She dramatically fanned herself with the memorial program, looking around with open contempt. "This place is a steam bath," she whispered loudly, clearly loud enough for the choir to hear. "Didn't she save enough money for air conditioning?" "Shoo," Mark hissed, but he kept his eyes on his phone. I gripped the carved hickory handle of my walking stick. It was a sturdy piece of wood I had crafted myself. My knuckles turned pure white from the pressure. Every fiber of my being wanted to stand up and order them out of the church. I wanted to tell them to show some shred of respect for the woman who had paid for Mark's university degree, funded their extravagant wedding, and bailed them out of trouble more times than I could count. But I said nothing. I am a man of discipline, forged in the military and hardened by years of responsibility. I would not allow a scene at Clarice's homegoing. The ceremony concluded, and we moved to the adjacent fellowship hall for the wake, or repast as the church ladies called it. The women of the church had lovingly prepared all of Clarice's favorite dishes: expertly fried chicken, buttered collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, and sweet cornbread. The rich, comforting scent of home cooking filled the air, soothing everyone except Sharon, who seemed physically repulsed by it. She stood stiffly near the wall, holding a paper plate delicately between two fingers, as if it were contaminated waste. I watched her from my quiet corner seat. My hearing aids are always turned up high, a fact most people, especially my son, forget, assuming I'm just a feeble old deaf man. But I hear everything. "I can't believe we have to eat this grease," Sharon hissed to Mark. "My stomach is turning just looking at it. And look at these people. This whole thing is so cheap. Where did all her money go, Mark? You always said she had a big savings account." "She spent it on her heart pills," Mark muttered, his mouth full of food he hadn't bothered to bless. "Well, at least that expense is finally gone," Sharon said, letting out a small, chilling, cruel laugh. "That's $500 a month back in our pockets." My heart seemed to stop completely. Then, it resumed beating with a slow, heavy, terrifying rhythm of absolute, consuming rage. My wife hadn't been in the ground for an hour, and they were already celebrating the money they saved from her life-saving heart medication. I looked down at my hands. They were visibly shaking, not from my age, but from the overpowering urge to wrap them around something. Anything. The room gradually emptied. Neighbors approached to shake my hand and offer sincere condolences. I nodded and thanked them politely, but my eyes remained fixed on my son. He was pacing anxiously near the exit, checking the time on his watch every few seconds. Finally, after the last guest had departed, Mark walked over to me. He didn't ask how I was holding up, nor did he offer me a ride home. He simply stood over me, blocking the light, casting me in his shadow. "Dad," he said, his voice completely flat and businesslike, "where is the key to Mom's safe deposit box?" I looked up at him slowly. I noted the dark circles under his eyes and the slight, nervous tick in his cheek. This was my boy, the child I'd taught to fish, the one Clarice had rocked to sleep. Now, he was looking at me as if I were a broken cash machine that had swallowed his card. "What exactly did you say?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp. "The safe key," Mark repeated, louder and with clear impatience. "Sharon says Mom had a life insurance policy. We need to check the documents. We're entitled to 50% of her estate as the next of kin." Sharon stepped up immediately, crossing her arms. "We need to start the probate process right away. Robert, funerals are incredibly expensive, and we have bills stacking up. We also know Clarice hoarded a good amount of cash in the house." I slowly stood up, my knees stiff and protesting the sudden movement. I leaned on my cane and looked them both directly in the eye. At 6 feet 2 inches, even bent by age, I still towered over Sharon. "Your mother is not even cold in the ground yet," I said, my voice dangerously low. "And you are standing here demanding money." "It's not about money, Dad. It's about asset management," Mark snapped defensively. "Don't be deliberately difficult. We know you don't understand how to handle large finances. You only worked in a warehouse. Mom handled absolutely everything. We're just trying to help you." "Help?" I scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "You are here to scavenge. There is no money for you, Mark. Not today." Mark stepped in even closer, invading my personal space. His eyes were wide and frantic. "Listen to me, old man. You have no idea what's going on. And this house is in trouble. We are in deep trouble. If we don't find that money by the end of the week, things are going to turn very, very bad." "What kind of bad?" I asked, my tone flat. "The kind where you end up living on the street, Dad," Mark spat out. Now, give me the damn key, or I swear I will turn this house upside down until I find it myself. He reached a hand out toward my jacket pocket. With a speed that astonished both of us, I slapped his hand away. Get out of my sight! I growled deep in my throat. Sharon gasped in fake shock. You're senile, she shrieked. You are completely losing your mind. We should have you institutionalized for your own safety. We'll talk about that later, Sharon, Mark said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Dad, you have until tonight. If I don't have that key, I'm calling social services. I'll tell them you're unfit to live alone. I will sell this house out from under you. He spun around and stormed away. Sharon shot me one final, disgusted look before hurrying after him, the clicking of her heels sounding like an accelerating clock counting down my final hours. I stood alone in the empty fellowship hall. The silence was overwhelming. My own son. He was desperate. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in the eyes of drug addicts and compulsive gamblers. He wasn't just driven by greed. He was genuinely afraid. Suddenly, my phone buzzed violently in my breast pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the device. The screen was cracked, but I could clearly read the caller ID. Mr. Silas Thorne. Clarissa's boss, the reclusive billionaire who hadn't left his property in 5 years. Why was he calling me? I answered the call. Robert. His voice wasn't the powerful baritone I expected. It was ragged, breathless, and urgent. Mr. Thorne, Listen to me, Robert. He cut me off immediately. I was going through the small safe Clarisse kept here in my private office. She left something for you. A confidential journal and an audio recording. I frowned, bewildered. A recording? Robert, you need to drive to my estate right now, he commanded. Do not go back to your house. Do not tell Mark. Do not tell that woman he married. If they find out what I know, you will not live through the night. What are you implying, Mr. Thorne? I asked, dread forming a cold knot in my stomach. They didn't just wait for her to die. Robert? Thorne whispered, the words heavy with accusation. They helped her along. The entire room seemed to spin violently. I grabbed the back of a nearby chair to brace myself and steady my vision. Come straight to the service entrance, Thorne continued, his voice regaining some firmness. The gate will be open for you. I have someone here that you need to meet immediately. I hung up the phone. The crushing grief that had held me down for days vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, unyielding resolve. I walked out of the church and climbed into my rusted, ancient 1995 Mercury Marauder pickup truck. It was an ugly, old relic, but the engine was strong and reliable. In the glove compartment, wrapped carefully in an oily rag, lay my old .45 caliber service pistol. I checked the chamber loaded. I was no longer just a widower. I was a veteran, a soldier re-entering hostile territory, and my son was the ultimate target. I told the handful of remaining church staff that I was leaving to see the pastor to settle the final bill for the funeral service. It was a blatant lie, but lies were the only language my son and his wife seemed to understand anymore. I grabbed my keys from the hook near the kitchen door, but before I could turn the handle, a perfectly manicured hand slammed against the wood, blocking my path. It was Sharon. She was still wearing that inappropriate, too-tight black dress, and her eyes were still hidden behind those ridiculous, enormous sunglasses, even in the dim hallway light. She held out her palm, her fingers wiggling with expectant greed. Where exactly do you think you're going, Robert? She asked, her voice dripping with the fake, sickening sweetness that always made my skin crawl. To pay the church? I repeated, keeping my voice flat and emotionless. You are not going anywhere without leaving the credit card, she stated, stepping closer. I need to go buy supplies for the guests who might stop by later. We urgently need proper wine. We need decent imported cheese. Not that garbage the church ladies served. I looked at her, truly looked at her. I saw the way her eyes kept darting to my back pocket, where my wallet was kept. She didn't want cheese. She wanted to rush to the high-end mall. She wanted a new designer handbag to match her funeral attire. She wanted to keep swiping my card until the magnetic strip completely wore off, just as she had done with Clarice's savings for years. I reached into my back pocket. Sharon smiled, a small, greedy, predatory smirk that showed too much tooth. I pulled out my wallet. Her hand twitched, anticipating the card. I opened it and deliberately pulled out a single, heavily wrinkled $20 bill. It was worn and creased, much like me. I let it drop from my fingers. It fluttered slowly through the humid air and landed flat on the linoleum floor, right between her expensive heels. "Go buy some cheap crackers," I said. Her mouth fell open in disbelief. She looked down at the $20 bill, then back up at me, her face blotchy with instantaneous, burning red humiliation and rage. "Is this some kind of joke?" she shrieked hysterically. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," I said, stepping forward deliberately. She flinched violently. For one fleeting second, the mask of entitlement dropped, and I saw pure, unadulterated fear. She stumbled backward, reflexively stepping aside to clear my path, though her eyes remained glued to the $20 bill on the floor. I knew she would pick it up. The moment the door closed behind me, she would grab it, because absolute greed has no dignity or pride. I walked out into the humid late afternoon air and climbed into my ancient Mercury pickup. The driver's side door creaked open and shut with a deep, mournful sound. The cab smelled reassuringly of old leather and pipe tobacco. It was my sanctuary. The engine roared to life with a brief cough and a sputter, but then it settled into its familiar, strong rhythm. This truck was like me, rough on the outside, but it never, ever quit. I backed out of the driveway, leaving my son and his wife inside to fight over the miserable scraps I had left behind in my house. As I drove down the street, the familiar houses blurred into a continuous stream. I wasn't merely driving to the other side of town. I was driving backward, through time and memory. I thought about Clarice. For 30 years, she had left our modest house at dawn and rarely returned until after dark. She took the public bus across town to the affluent north side, to the massive, gated estates where the driveways were literally longer than our entire block. She scrubbed floors. She polished antique silver. She organized lives that were fundamentally not her own. To the outside world, she was nothing more than a housekeeper, a servant, almost invisible. But Clarice saw everything. She knew exactly where the secrets were buried, because she was the one faithfully dusting the closets. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling my knuckles pop with the tension. My son, Mark, believed I was just a slow, tired old man who once shuffled boxes in a depot. He had conveniently forgotten what I did before the warehouse. He had forgotten that the military sent me to a war-torn jungle half a world away when I was barely 18. You learn indelible things in a war zone. You learn that the quietest moments are almost always the most dangerous. You learn to scan the long grass for any movement that shouldn't be there. And you learn, most critically, that when the enemy is smiling, he is usually holding a very sharp knife behind his back. I had been watching Mark and Sharon for months. I noticed the flashy, expensive watch Mark now wore, a timepiece that cost more than my entire truck. I noticed the way Sharon abruptly stopped, leaving her store receipts on the kitchen counter. Most ominously, I noticed the way Clarice had become strangely withdrawn and quiet in the final weeks before her death, her eyes nervously darting to her phone every single time it rang. I had been professionally trained to spot an ambush, yet I never once thought the enemy would be sleeping in my own guest bedroom. I merged the old Mercury onto the highway, feeling the whole truck vibrate beneath my hands. I checked my mirrors constantly. Old habits, ingrained over decades, die hard. Nobody was following me. Mark was far too preoccupied trying to locate the safe key to even notice that I was gone. I took the exit for Highland Park. The very air changed here. It smelled cleanly of expensive fresh-cut grass and old, established wealth. The perimeter fences became higher, the massive wrought iron gates more intricate and elaborate. I pulled up to the enormous gates of the Thorne estate. A security camera immediately whirred and turned its lens toward me. I rolled down the window. "Robert Kingston," I stated clearly. The gate clicked softly and swung open without a sound. I drove up the long, winding paved driveway, which was lined with ancient oak trees that were older than the state itself. My rusted, battered pickup looked like a dirty stain on a pristine white sheet against the manicured landscaping. I parked next to a sleek, silver Rolls-Royce Ghost. The stark contrast might have made a lesser man feel small, but for me it simply made me feel more focused. I got out and adjusted the lapels of my suit jacket. It was a cheap, off-the-rack suit I'd bought 10 years ago, but I wore it with the posture and quiet confidence of a man who answers to no one. The front door opened before I could even raise my hand to knock. Silas Thorne stood there. He was 80 years old, confined to a motorized wheelchair, his body clearly withered by time and chronic illness, but his eyes were sharp and glittering like broken glass. He was wearing a deep velvet smoking jacket and a beautiful silk cravat. He didn't look at me as if I were one of the servants, nor did he look at me like a charity case. He looked at me like a commander who was about to enter a difficult battle and was immensely relieved to see another seasoned soldier arrive. "Robert," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "Mr. Thorne." I nodded. He extended a hand. It was thin and trembled slightly, but his grip was surprisingly strong and solid. We didn't shake hands like businessmen. We clasped hands like brothers facing a shared tragedy. "I am so sorry about Clarice," he said, his expression softening with genuine sadness. "She was the finest woman I have ever known. Better than me, better than all of us." "Thank you, sir," I managed, my throat tightening up. "Come inside," Thorne said, expertly spinning his wheelchair around. "We don't have much time. Your son will realize you're gone very soon." I followed him into the enormous foyer. The floors were polished Italian marble, and the ceilings soared over 20 feet high. It was a palace, yes, but it felt utterly cold and empty. Clarice had been the quiet warmth in this house. Without her presence, it was nothing more than a sterile museum. We moved past the sweeping grand staircase, past the formal dining room where a massive table sat empty, and down a long hallway lined with dark, disapproving portraits of Thorne's deceased ancestors. They seemed to be staring down at me with condescending disapproval. I stared right back at them. I had buried more men than they had ever met. Thorne led me into his private study at the rear of the mansion. It was a room I had never seen before. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with rare, leather-bound first editions. The air was rich with the scent of cedar and aged brandy. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut, completely blocking out the afternoon sun and casting the room into a deep shadow. But we were not alone. Standing rigidly by the enormous stone fireplace was a man I did not recognize. He was tall and lean, wearing a trench coat that looked like it had seen better days and hard use. He had a noticeable, jagged scar running down his cheek, and his eyes had the vacant, hard look of a man who had seen the absolute bottom of a liquor bottle and the deepest, darkest bottom of humanity itself. "Robert, this is Mr. Vance," Thorne announced. "He is a private investigator. Clarice hired him approximately 2 months ago." My heart skipped a beat in my chest. Clarice hired a PI? Why? Vance nodded briefly at me. He didn't smile, looking at me with a strange combination of professional pity and quiet respect. "Please, take a seat," Thorne invited, gesturing toward a heavy leather armchair placed directly in front of his massive oak desk. I sat down. The old leather creaked ominously beneath me. I felt like I was in a tense police interrogation, waiting for the real questioning to begin. Thorne wheeled himself smoothly behind the desk. He placed his frail hands on a small stack of items lying precisely in the center of the green desk blotter. There was a small, black, leather-bound journal. I recognized it immediately. It was Clarice's daily prayer and meditation journal. She carried it absolutely everywhere. Next to it was a thick, sealed envelope stuffed full of photographs. "I found this in the private safe Clarice maintained here," Thorne explained softly. "She had her own combination. I never once asked what was inside. I trusted her implicitly. But after she passed, I knew I had to look. I needed to ensure all her affairs were properly in order." He gently pushed the worn journal toward me. Open it, Robert. Read the very last entry. My hands were shaking as I reached for the book. The leather was still faintly warm, as if she had just been holding it moments ago. I opened it to the silk bookmark. The handwriting was hers, neat, familiar loops, but the ink was shaky, almost frantic, as if she had been writing in a hurry or in a state of terror. I read the chilling words. Mark asked for money again. I told him no. He looked at me with eyes I did not recognize. He looked at me like he hated me. I found the pills in his coat pocket today. They look identical to my heart medication, but they are certainly not mine. I am scared, Robert. I am truly scared of our own son. I stopped reading, my head spinning. The entire room seemed to suddenly tilt violently. I couldn't draw a breath. Vance, the investigator, spoke up, his voice low and gravelly. Look at the photographs, Mr. Kingston. I reached for the thick envelope. I poured the entire contents onto the smooth oak desk. Dozens of photographs spilled out. They were grainy, clearly taken with a long-range lens, but the subjects were horrifyingly clear. There was Mark. He was standing in a dark alleyway, deep in conversation with a man who had visible, intimidating tattoos on his neck. He was clearly handing over a thick wad of cash. There was another photo, Mark and Sharon sitting in a parked car. Sharon was laughing, holding up a bottle of expensive champagne. But the last photograph made me completely freeze. It felt like a physical, crippling blow to my chest. It had been taken through the kitchen window of my own home. The timestamp clearly read 2 a.m., 3 nights ago. In the photo, Mark was standing directly at the kitchen counter. He was holding 2 different orange prescription bottles. One was Clarice's critical heart medication. The other was unlabeled. He was pouring the pills from one bottle directly into the other. He was smiling. I stared in absolute horror at the image. My son, my own flesh and blood, the little boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had patiently taught to tie his shoes. He was switching the life-saving pills. He killed her? I whispered the words, which felt like jagged gravel tearing at my mouth. He killed his own mother. Thorne leaned forward, his face a grim mask. He didn't just kill her, Robert. He executed her. And now he's coming for you. Why? I demanded, looking up, my eyes burning but still dry. Why would he do this? Thorne pointed to the journal once more. Turn the page, Robert. Look at the one thing she was desperately hiding from you. Look at what she was hiding from everyone. I turned the page, and there, neatly secured into the book, was a recent bank statement. The balance was not a few $1,000s. It wasn't even $100,000. It was $3 million. My Clarice, the humble housekeeper, the woman who meticulously clipped coupons and mended my socks. She was a millionaire, and Mark knew. The realization hit me with the force of an oncoming freight train. He hadn't killed her because he hated her, not truly. He killed her because his crushing debt had driven him insane with greed. He killed her for an immediate, massive payday. I stood up abruptly. The heavy leather chair fell backward with a deafening crash. I am going to kill him, I roared, the sound tearing from my throat. I reached instinctively for my back waistband, where the cold steel of my revolver usually pressed against my spine. I am going to drive straight back there, and I am going to put a bullet in his head. No! Thorne shouted, his voice cracking like a whip. I stopped, panting heavily, my hand frozen mid-reach for the imaginary gun. If you kill him now, you go to a federal prison, and he wins, Vance said, stepping forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. You will rot in a cell for life, and Sharon will spend every dime of that money on exotic vacations and useless jewelry. Is that the legacy Clarice would have wanted? I looked at the photograph of my son, the monster. Then what do? I asked, my voice finally breaking. We trap him, Thorne said, his eyes now cold and hard as flint. We force him to confess. We make him completely destroy himself. But to do that, Vance added, you have to go back to the house. Go back? I asked, aghast. To that house? With him? Yes, Thorne confirmed. You have to go back. You have to play the part. the heartbroken, confused old man. You have to make him think he has already won. You have to make him believe you are utterly weak and defeated. Can you truly do that, Robert? Can you look the man who brutally murdered your wife in the eye and pretend you know absolutely nothing? I looked down at the journal. I looked at the grainy photographs. I thought of Clarice. I thought of the sheer terror she must have experienced in her final, lonely days. I took a deep, steadying breath. I slowly straightened my suit jacket. I picked up my heavy cane. I was a soldier once. I know how to follow the most difficult orders. And I know exactly how to wait patiently for the perfect kill shot. I will do it, I said. Thorne nodded once. Good. Now listen carefully to the plan. And as he meticulously laid out the strategy, I felt the old soldier deep inside me begin to wake up. My son believed he was the cunning predator. He believed I was nothing more than easy prey. He was about to discover, in the most painful way possible, that he had just walked into the den of a very old, very dangerous lion. I drove back to my house in my old Mercury Marauder pickup truck. The steering wheel felt like a piece of ice under my grip, and the old engine hummed a low, steady rhythm that usually comforted me. But today it sounded like a funeral dirge. I kept checking the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but to look at my own face. Silas Thorne had told me to play a role. He wanted me to be the grieving, confused old man my son believed I was. I tried to smile, tried to cultivate a look of senility and weakness, but the face staring back at me was hard. The lines around my mouth were etched deep with a cold, potent rage that tasted like battery acid. I had to deliberately soften my eyes. I had to slump my shoulders. I had to bury the veteran, the soldier who wanted nothing more than to immediately strangle his enemy and resurrect the lost, confused father. It was the hardest acting job of my life. Harder than boot camp, harder than the war. Because the enemy wasn't a stranger across a jungle clearing. The enemy was the boy I had patiently taught to catch a baseball. The enemy was the man who had sat at my dinner table, eaten my food, all while meticulously planning my wife's murder. Every mile marker I passed felt like a step closer to hell. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. The sheer physical disgust of having to face him again was almost overwhelming. I wanted to turn the truck around and keep driving until the gas tank was empty, but I couldn't. Clarice needed me. Justice needed me. I pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. I sat there for a moment, breathing in the comforting scent of old tobacco and dust, gathering the strength required to walk into the house that was no longer a home. I stepped onto the porch, and the front door was already ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the sense of profound violation. This was Clarice's sanctuary. She kept it spotless. She kept it sacred. Now the door hung open like a broken jaw. I stepped into the foyer, and the sound hit me first. It was a tearing sound, wet and sharp, like fabric being ripped from its foundation. I walked into the living room and stopped dead. The air was thick with dust and stuffing feathers. Sharon was on her knees in the exact center of the room. In her hand, she held a yellow box cutter. She was savagely attacking Clarice's favorite floral sofa, the one Clarice had saved for 3 long years to buy. Sharon was slashing the cushions open one by one, plunging her hands into the foam stuffing and ripping it out in great, frantic white handfuls. She looked like a wild, desperate animal. Her hair was messy, her dress was smeared with dust, and she was muttering to herself, "Where is it? Where is the hidden cash?" She didn't even notice me standing there. She tossed a ruined cushion aside and stabbed the back of the sofa, slicing the fabric with a violent hiss. The floor was completely littered with scattered papers, books pulled violently from the shelves, and shattered ceramic knickknacks. It looked as though a small tornado had touched down inside my living room. But then, I heard another distinct sound coming from down the hall. A high-pitched mechanical whine, a drill. My stomach dropped like a stone. The master bedroom, our bedroom. I walked down the long hallway, my cane tapping softly on the hardwood. The pictures on the walls were crooked. Our wedding photo was lying face down on the floor, the glass cracked over Clarice's smiling face. I stepped carefully over it, making sure not to crush her image. The whining noise grew louder, grinding violently against my nerves. I pushed open the bedroom door. The room was utterly unrecognizable. The dresser drawers were completely pulled out and dumped onto the bed. Clarice's clothes, her Sunday dresses, her nightgowns, were trampled carelessly underfoot. And there, in the corner, was Mark. He was sweating visibly through his bright, cream-colored suit. He was clutching a heavy-duty power drill, pressing it with all his weight against the small wall safe Clarice had cleverly hidden behind the painting of the Last Supper. The painting was tossed carelessly in the corner. Mark was grunting with effort, his face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly greed. He leaned into the drill. The bit was screeching against the metal lock. Smoke rose from the friction, filling the room with the acrid smell of burning steel. He wasn't looking for legal documents. He wasn't looking for sentimental keepsakes. He was looking for the massive payout he believed he was owed. I needed to get his attention, and I needed to stop the sickening desecration before I lost all control and completely ruined Thorne's plan. I let my body go slack. I allowed my knees to buckle just slightly. I deliberately loosened my grip on my hickory cane and let it fall. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud clatter that cut through the noise of the drill like a sudden gunshot. Mark jumped violently. The drill slipped, screeching viciously across the metal door of the safe and gouging a deep mark in the wall. He spun around, wild-eyed and panting heavily. His eyes were red-rimmed and frantic. He looked at me, and for a terrifying second, he didn't see his father. He saw a random intruder. He saw an immediate obstacle. Then, recognition dawned, but it brought no shame, only intense anger. He dropped the heavy drill onto the pile of Clarice's clothes. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger at the open safe. "It's empty!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Empty! There is nothing in here but dust. Where is it? Where is the money? Where are the bonds?" I stared at him, letting my mouth hang open slightly, feigning the deep confusion of a man whose world had stopped making sense. I leaned against the door frame, clutching my chest as if my heart were suddenly failing. I did not speak. I simply looked at the empty safe, then back at him, letting the silence stretch, allowing his panic to fester and grow. He savagely kicked the bed frame. "Don't look at me like that, old man," he shouted. "You knew, didn't you? You knew she moved it. You and her were always whispering, always hiding things from me." Mark marched quickly across the room, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. He was a big man. He had played high school football, and he was using that size now to intimidate me. He grabbed the front of my jacket, bunching the cheap fabric tightly in his fist, and shoved me forcefully back against the door frame. His face was mere inches from mine. I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath, mixed with the acrid scent of his fear. He reached down and picked up the heavy power drill again. He revved it once, the sound sharp and instantly menacing, right next to my ear. He held the rapidly spinning bit inches from my face. The metal was a blurry gray spiral of latent violence. "Tell me," he hissed, his spit landing on my cheek. "Tell me where the old hag hid the money, or I swear to God, I will drill the answer out of your skull. Speak, old man. Where is the inheritance?" The drill bit spun inches from my nose, a blur of gray steel that smelled faintly of ozone and pure violence. Mark was breathing hard, his eyes wide with a total madness that had clearly consumed him whole. I felt the intense heat radiating from the motor against my cheek. My heart was already pounding against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of adrenaline and real fear, but I knew I had to weaponize it. Thorne's voice echoed in my mind, clear and commanding. "Buy time, Robert. Play the victim. Do not let him kill you before we have the proof." I looked into my son's eyes, and I saw no genuine recognition there. Only the cold, hard stare of a stranger who desperately wanted something I possessed. He screamed again, demanding the location of money that wasn't actually in that safe. I knew that if I stayed standing, he was absolutely going to use that drill. He was far past the point of any reason. I let my eyelids flutter weakly. I allowed my jaw to go slack. I reached up with a trembling hand and clutched tightly at the fabric of my shirt, right over my heart. I forced the air out of my lungs in a ragged, wheezing gasp that sounded exactly like a dying engine. My knees truly buckled this time as I let gravity violently take me. I slid down the doorframe, my back scraping roughly against the wood until I hit the floor with a heavy, jarring thud. I curled into myself, groaning low in my throat, my hand desperately clawing at the carpet. It wasn't entirely acting. The stress, the grief, the sheer physical threat had spiked my blood pressure to dangerous levels. I could feel the room spinning. Mark stepped back abruptly, the drill still whirring in his hand, his expression instantly shifting from wild aggression to sudden, cold panic. He wasn't worried about losing his father. He was worried about losing the combination to the trust fund. He backed away, the tool winding down with a mechanical whine, leaving a ringing silence in the room broken only by my staged, desperate gasps for air. Sharon appeared suddenly in the doorway, her hair wild and her black funeral dress now covered in white feathers from the decimated sofa. She took one look at me writhing on the floor and immediately dropped the box cutter she had been using to eviscerate my furniture. Her face went pale, not with genuine concern, but with instant, frantic calculation. "Don't let him die!" she screeched, rushing forward and grabbing Mark's arm with a powerful, painful grip. "If he dies right now, we lose everything, Mark. He's the only one who knows where the assets are. If he croaks, that money disappears into the legal system. Think, you idiot." Mark looked down at me, then at the drill in his hand. He cursed loudly and tossed the heavy tool onto the bed where it landed squarely on Clarice's Sunday hat. He knelt roughly beside me, grabbing my collar with both hands and shaking me violently. "Wake up, old man," he shouted, his spit flying onto my face. "You don't get to die yet. Not until you tell me where the money is." He raised his hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sting was sharp and hot, but I kept my eyes half closed, focusing completely on my breathing, making it shallow and irregular. I let my head loll to the side. I needed to give them a number large enough to completely blind them with greed, a number large enough to make them decide to keep me alive until the lawyer arrived. I licked my dry lips and whispered hoarsely, "The trust." Mark froze. He leaned in even closer, his ear almost touching my mouth. "What trust? Say it again." I wheezed, forcing the words out between gasps. "The trust fund. Clarice set it up. $2 million. The lawyer, he comes next week." I let my head fall back against the hard floorboards, as if the intense effort of speaking had completely drained the last of my life force. I watched through slit eyes as Mark looked up at Sharon. A slow, greedy, triumphant smile spread across his face, instantly erasing all the panic. $2 million, he whispered, testing the sheer weight of the words. The number hung heavily in the air like a powerful spell. 2 million. It was enough to settle his crushing gambling debts. Enough to buy Sharon's immediate silence. Enough to fuel their pathetic delusions for a lifetime. I witnessed the complete transformation in my son. The terrified murderer instantly vanished, replaced by the frantic, hungry opportunist. He no longer saw a dying father. He saw a winning lottery ticket that desperately needed to be kept safe until cashing day. He grabbed me roughly under the arms and hauled me up. He wasn't gentle. He dragged me toward the bed, carelessly kicking Clarice's clothes out of the way. He threw me onto the mattress. My body bounced heavily on the springs. He stood over me, panting, his eyes gleaming with a feverish, desperate light. "We have to keep him alive," Sharon said, pacing the room in circles. "Just until next week. Just until the lawyer comes and we can force him to sign it over. We need to make absolutely sure he doesn't talk to anyone else." Mark nodded in grim agreement. He reached into my jacket pocket. I tensed, but I did not resist. He pulled out my smartphone. It was a new model Clarice had bought me for my birthday so I could easily see pictures of our grandkids. He looked at it, then looked back at me. "You won't be needing this," he said, slipping the phone into his own pocket, effectively cutting off my lifeline to the outside world. You need rest, Dad. Lots of rest. He walked backward out of the room, his eyes never leaving mine. He looked exactly like a zookeeper locking a dangerous animal in its cage. Sharon followed him, casting one last, suspicious glance at me before disappearing into the hallway. The door slammed shut with a heavy, jarring thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Then came the final sound that sealed my temporary fate. The metallic slide of the deadbolt, followed by the sharp, confirming click of the lock engaging. I was a prisoner in the very house I had paid for with 40 years of sweat. I lay perfectly still on the bed, listening to their footsteps retreating down the hall, listening to them whispering excitedly about millions that didn't actually exist, planning a future they would never, ever see. I stared up at the ceiling and waited patiently for the silence to settle before I dared to move. They thought they had taken my phone. They thought they had effectively cut me off. They didn't know a thing about the loose floorboard hidden directly beneath the bed, or what Clarice and I had secretly hidden beneath it. 2 agonizing days passed in that stifling bedroom. The air grew heavy with my own sweat and the faint, lingering scent of Clarice's preferred perfume that still clung faintly to the curtains. The sun, when it appeared, crawled slowly across the floorboards, marking the relentless passage of time like a prisoner scratching tally marks on a wall. I spent most of the time sitting rigidly in the armchair that faced the window, watching the outside world continue oblivious to my plight. The neighbor walked his dog. The mailman delivered the usual bills. None of them knew that inside the modest yellow house on Elm Street, an old man was being held captive. Twice a day, the heavy lock would click, and the door would swing open just a crack. Sharon would slide a plastic plate across the floor with her foot, treating me as if I were a stray mongrel she was feeding. The first meal was a sandwich made with bread that was already beginning to bloom with green mold on the crust. The cheese was hard and sweating oil. The water was lukewarm tap water served in a visibly dirty glass. "Eat up, old man," she would sneer through the crack in the doorway. "We're cutting costs until the trust fund is cleared." I looked at the disgusting food, and my stomach immediately churned. Every instinct screamed at me to throw it back at her, to starve myself rather than accept her insults. But I was a soldier. Soldiers do not starve out of pride. Soldiers consume whatever nourishment they can find to keep the machine running, to maintain strength. I meticulously picked off the mold with shaking fingers. I ate the dry bread. I drank the water. I desperately needed my strength. I performed quiet push-ups against the wall when they were sleeping. I paced the confined room to keep the blood circulating in my legs. I wasn't just surviving, I was actively preparing. I was sharpening both my mind and my body for the critical moment the door would finally open wide for the last time. Night felt like a heavy, oppressive blanket suffocating the entire house. The structure settled into silence, but it was a restless, tense quiet, filled only with the creaks and groans of old wood. I pressed my ear tightly against the wood of the door. The house was old, built back in the 1920s, and the ventilation ducts carried sound efficiently like a telephone wire. I heard heavy footsteps pacing relentlessly in the living room. Back and forth, the sound of a trapped animal pacing its cage. Then, the sudden ring of a cell phone shattered the silence. It was Mark's. He answered on the very first ring. His voice was low, but the naked desperation in his tone made it carry clearly through the thin walls. I strained to listen, painstakingly deciphering the words through the wood. "Please listen to me, Rico," I heard him plead. "I have the money coming. It's a trust fund. My mother left it to me. No, do not send anyone to the house. I swear on my life I will have it." There was a pause, a long, terrifying silence where I could almost visualize the voice on the other end delivering a death sentence. Then Mark spoke again, his voice cracking with fear and tears. $500,000 is a lot of cash to move in 2 days. I need more time. Just give me a week. Please, Rico, I lost it all on the spread, but I can make it back. Do not touch my legs. I heard a wrenching sob, a grown man crying to a gangster. I finally understood everything. It wasn't just simple greed driving him. It was sheer survival. My son had recklessly gambled away $500,000 betting on sports games he clearly didn't understand. He was deep in the hole with the kind of men who don't send simple late notices. They send men with baseball bats and pliers. The critical deadline was 3 days away. If he didn't pay, he was a dead man walking. And I was his collateral. He desperately needed that $2 million not to buy a yacht, but to buy his life. He was going to squeeze me until I signed the papers or until I died, because he effectively had a gun to his own head. I slid down the door until I hit the floor. My son was not just a murderer. He was a desperate fool. And desperate fools are truly the most dangerous creatures on earth. I waited patiently until I heard Mark pass out on the living room couch. The faint clinking of a glass against a bottle told me he was drowning his terror in alcohol. I crawled slowly toward the bed. Clarice had been a brilliant woman. She anticipated storms long before the first cloud even appeared. Years ago, when Mark first started stealing small amounts from her purse, she hired a quiet carpenter to install a secret false bottom in the floorboard right under her side of the bed. She told me at the time it was just for expensive jewelry. I knew immediately it was for life-or-death emergencies. I pushed the heavy mattress aside with a grunt. My muscles burned with the effort, but I completely ignored the pain. I located the loose board and painstakingly pried it up with the handle of a metal spoon I had secretly hidden from my dinner tray. Inside, wrapped securely in oilcloth, lay my salvation. A Nokia brick phone, fully charged and turned off. And right beside it, the cold, heavy, reassuring weight of a .38 snub-nose revolver. I checked the cylinder 5 rounds. Enough to end this entire situation. But Thorne was right. I needed final, irrefutable justice, not just simple blood. I turned on the phone. The screen glowed a faint green in the darkness. I quickly typed a message to the number Thorne had given me, using a simple, agreed-upon code. The wolf is at the door. Debt is 500 large. Deadline 3 days. Need extraction. I waited. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly, like hours. I watched the small battery indicator. I watched the signal bars. Then the phone buzzed against my palm. A single text message. It read, "Lawyer Scott Gold arrives at 900 hours tomorrow. He has the paperwork. Get ready to play your part. Do not break character. We are coming for you." I immediately turned off the phone and carefully hid it back under the floorboard. I slid the gun under my pillow. I lay back in the dark and stared up at the ceiling. Tomorrow, the final curtain would rise. I closed my eyes and quietly practiced my tremors. Tomorrow, I would be the frail old man they desperately wanted to see. But inside, I was already pulling the trigger. The sun came up, looking gray and stark, like a judgment I wasn't quite ready to face. But the click of the deadbolt told me that showtime had officially started. The door swung open, and for the very first time in 2 days, I wasn't greeted with a sneer or a kick. Sharon stood there holding a steaming mug of coffee, her face plastered with a wide smile that looked visibly painful. "Good morning, Dad," she chirped, her voice an octave higher than usual, dripping with fake sweetness. "We have a very important guest. You need to look presentable." She handed me the mug. It said "World's Best Grandpa" on the side. The irony tasted overwhelmingly bitter, but I drank the coffee quickly because I needed the caffeine to sharpen my edges for the performance. Mark appeared immediately behind her, wearing a fresh, if slightly rumpled, suit and a tie that was visibly too tight. He looked like a desperate man trying to sell a car with no engine. He grabbed my arm, not to hurt me this time, but to carefully steady me. "Easy there, old-timer," he said, loudly enough for any imaginary neighbors to hear. "Let's get you into the living room. Mr. Gold is here." They walked me down the hallway as if I were a delicate piece of fragile china they were terrified to drop. I leaned heavily on my cane, shuffling my feet, playing the part of the confused invalid perfectly. In the living room sat a man who looked like he could foreclose on your house simply by looking at it. Scott Gold was not a physically large man, but he took up all the available space in the room. He wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than my first house, and his eyes were black, polished marbles behind rimless glasses. He didn't stand when I entered. He just watched me with the focused intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse. "Mr. Kingston," he said, his voice smooth and professional as oil. "I am Scott Gold. I represent your late wife's estate. Please sit." Mark guided me carefully to the armchair, the one Sharon hadn't slashed to ribbons yet. He sat right next to me, perched nervously on the edge of the cushion, his knee bouncing with a restless energy that shook the floorboards. Sharon sat on the arm of his chair, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law. We were the picture-perfect grieving family, if you meticulously ignored the faint smell of desperation and the loaded gun hidden under my mattress. Gold opened a professional leather briefcase and pulled out a single, thick document bound in blue legal paper. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Mark, then at me. "Mrs. Kingston was a very prudent and meticulous woman," he began. "She set up a living trust approximately 3 years ago. The assets within that trust, including a substantial investment portfolio and several offshore accounts, total approximately $3 million. Mark made a guttural noise in his throat, like a dying engine. His eyes immediately bulged. $3 million. He quickly looked at Sharon, and I watched the pure, blinding greed wash over them, temporarily erasing their fear. Gold continued, completely ignoring my son's reaction. "According to the precise terms of the trust, upon her death, the entirety of the estate immediately transfers to her husband, Robert Kingston." Mark nodded eagerly, reaching out to pat my shoulder with sudden, false affection. "That's right," he said, his palm visibly sweating against my jacket. "Dad is the sole beneficiary. We're simply here to help him manage it properly." Gold raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "There is a significant condition, Mr. King." Clarice was very specific. She included a competency clause. Because of the substantial value of the assets, the beneficiary must be formally certified as being of sound mind and body by an independent medical professional before he can access a single cent or sign any checks. Mark instantly froze. His hand stopped patting my shoulder. Gold leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave, becoming serious. "If the beneficiary is formally found to be incompetent, senile, or generally unable to make rational financial decisions, the trust automatically locks. The assets are completely frozen and placed into a high-yield holding account for a fixed period of 10 years to ensure their total protection. During that time, no one, not even family members or legal guardians, can access the principal amount. 10 years. The words hung in the air like thick smoke. I watched the blood completely drain from Mark's face. He didn't have 10 years. He didn't even have 10 days. He had Rico and the guys with baseball bats waiting impatiently for him. He needed that money today. The trap Thorne and I had meticulously built was brilliantly simple. We knew they planned to declare me incompetent in order to steal the money. So we made competence the sole key to the vault. Sharon, blinded by her own script, clearly didn't understand the gravity of the timeline. She was still sticking to the original plan, the one where they threw me into a care home and went on a lavish shopping spree. She let out a dramatic sigh and sadly shook her head. "Oh, Mr. Gold, that is such a shame," she said, her voice dripping with fake, practiced sympathy. "We have been so worried sick about Robert lately. He's been forgetting things badly. He leaves the stove burners on. He talks quite often to people who aren't physically there. Just yesterday, he didn't even know where he was. I simply don't think he can possibly pass a competency test. It might honestly be best for everyone if we just accept that the trust needs to be frozen. Or perhaps you can transfer legal guardianship to Mark." She looked expectantly at Gold, clearly expecting him to nod sympathetically. Instead, Gold started to slowly close the blue folder. "I see," he said, reaching for the clasp. "If that is indeed the case, I will have to file the paperwork to lock the assets immediately. It is for his own financial protection, of course. We can revisit the status of the trust in a decade." The lock clicked shut. The sound was like a sharp gunshot to Mark. He violently jumped up from his chair, knocking Sharon sideways. "No!" he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Shut up, Sharon. You don't know what you are talking about." He turned to Gold, his hands waving frantically. She's exaggerating wildly. Dad is absolutely fine. He's just grieving. Look at him. He's sharp as a tack. He remembers everything. Don't you, Dad? He grabbed my shoulder again, digging his fingers in hard enough to bruise. Tell him, Dad. Tell him you are fine. Tell him you are not crazy. I looked at my son. I saw the sweat streaming down his temple. I saw the naked terror in his eyes. He was literally begging me to be sane so he could successfully rob me. It was pathetic. I looked at Gold and blinked slowly. I feel fine, I said, my voice shaky but perfectly clear. I just miss my Clarice. Gold looked at me, then at Mark, then back down at the file. He tapped his fingers lightly on the leather case, considering. Very well, he said finally. If you insist he is competent, we can proceed. But I require definitive proof. I cannot release $3 million on your word alone. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket. I have scheduled a comprehensive medical evaluation for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. It is with an independent physician. If Mr. Kingston passes, he gets the checkbook. If he fails, the vault locks for 10 years. Do we have an understanding? Mark let out a breath that sounded exactly like a sob. Yes, he said, wiping his forehead frantically with his sleeve. Yes, we understand. Dad will be there. He will pass. I promise you. Gold stood up and smoothly buttoned his jacket. Good day, gentlemen. He walked out the door, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and thick with threat. Mark immediately turned to me. The panic was suddenly gone, replaced by a cold, dark resolve. He smiled, and it was the smile of a wolf looking directly at a lamb. You are going to be the healthiest man in the entire world tomorrow, Dad, he whispered menacingly. I am going to make absolutely sure of it. Night fell over the house like a heavy shroud, and the air inside grew thick and oppressive with the smell of roasting meat and impending violence. For the first time in the 10 years she had lived under my roof, Sharon was actually cooking. She wasn't just heating up takeout or throwing frozen nuggets into the microwave. She was preparing a genuine meal. The aroma of a pot roast and potatoes filled the kitchen, effectively masking the faint scent of bleach she had used to scrub the floor earlier. It was a calculated performance, a domestic scene staged meticulously for an audience of one, me. Mark sat rigidly at the kitchen table, nervously drumming his fingers on the wood. His leg bounced up and down rapidly, a nervous tic he had developed since the terrifying phone call with Rico. He watched me with the focused intensity of a hawk watching a dying rabbit. I sat in my usual spot, my hands folded patiently over the head of my cane, trying to look frail and defeated, trying to look like I wasn't constantly calculating the distance to the back door. Sharon hummed quietly to herself as she moved around the stove. It was a cheerful, sickeningly cheerful tune that sounded grotesque in the tense silence of the house. She was wearing an apron over her expensive designer clothes, expertly playing the role of the devoted, beautiful daughter-in-law. Dinner is almost ready, Dad, she chirped, turning to flash me a smile that showed too many teeth. We made your favorite pot roast with extra gravy. We urgently need you strong for tomorrow. You have to pass that test with flying colors so we can get this trust sorted out and take proper care of you. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes dull and unfocused. Thank you, Sharon, I mumbled. That is very kind of you. It is the least we can do, she said, turning back to the counter. We just want you to be happy. We want you to be comfortable. I watched her back. I watched the way her shoulders tensed slightly. I knew that posture. It was the posture of a soldier planting a mine. I shifted subtly in my chair, angling my body slightly toward the dark window that looked out onto the backyard. Outside it was pitch black. The glass had instantly turned into a mirror, reflecting the kitchen scene behind me with unnerving clarity. I did not look directly at Sharon. I looked at her ghost in the glass. She undoubtedly thought I was staring blankly at my own reflection, lost in the dementia she claimed I had, but I was intently watching her hands. She reached into the pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small, white paper packet. It looked exactly like the kind of envelope a street corner dealer hands you through a car window. She glanced quickly over her shoulder at me. I let my jaw hang slack and stared blankly into the distance at the window. She turned back to the stove, completely satisfied that I was mentally gone. In the reflection, I saw her tear the packet open. She tipped it carefully over the bowl of savory soup she had set aside specifically for me. A fine, white powder cascaded quickly into the dark broth, dissolving almost instantly. She stirred it vigorously, the spoon clinking sharply against the ceramic. 1 stir, 2 stirs, 3, expertly mixing the death into the dinner. She wasn't just seasoning my food. She was spiking it. I quickly considered the overheard conversation. We switch her medications. We tell her she did things she didn't do. But this was different. They needed me lucid and coherent for the doctor tomorrow. Didn't they? Or maybe they didn't. Maybe the plan had changed. Maybe they suddenly realized I was far too much of a dangerous risk. Maybe they planned to drag a heavily drugged, drooling version of me to a crooked doctor who would sign absolutely anything for cash. Or maybe they simply wanted to make absolutely sure I slept soundly through the night so I couldn't possibly escape. Whatever was stealthily dissolved in that bowl, I knew one thing for certain. It was not a vitamin. She picked up the bowl and turned around, her face perfectly composed into a mask of maternal care. "Here we go, Dad," she said, setting the steaming bowl in front of me. "Eat up while it is hot. The gravy will do you good." I looked down at the brown liquid. It smelled savory, salty, and lethal. I looked at Mark. He was watching me intently, his eyes locked on the spoon in my hand. "Eat, Dad," he urged, his voice tight with tension. "You desperately need the nutrition." I lifted the spoon. My hand trembled slightly. I let the tremor purposefully grow worse, shaking the utensil until it rattled loudly against the bowl. I lifted a spoonful toward my mouth. Mark leaned forward, holding his breath. Sharon wiped her hands on her apron, waiting patiently. I brought the spoon almost to my lips, then let a violent, staged spasm take over my arm. I jerked my hand sideways. The spoon hit the edge of the bowl hard. "Oops," I whispered, my voice faint. I swept my entire arm across the table in a clumsy, wide arc, knocking the bowl completely over. It flew off the edge of the table and shattered violently on the linoleum floor. The soup splashed everywhere, coating the cabinets, the chair legs, and my shoes in a hot, sticky mess. "Oh no!" I cried, my voice cracking with feigned distress. "I am so clumsy. I am so sorry," Sharon shrieked, jumping back to desperately avoid the splash. "You stupid old man," she yelled, instantly forgetting her role for a second. "Look what you did." Mark stood up immediately, his face red with frustration. "It is okay," he said through heavily gritted teeth, forcing himself to remain calm. "It was an accident, Sharon. Clean it up. We will get him another bowl." But before Sharon could move, a low, growling sound came from directly under the table. It was Precious, Sharon's prize-winning English bulldog. The dog waddled out from the living room, instantly attracted by the rich smell of the meat. "Precious, no?" Sharon shouted frantically, reaching for the dog's collar. But the dog was surprisingly fast for a creature that weighed 50 pounds. She lunged instantly for the puddle of gravy, lapping it up with greedy, enthusiastic noises. She licked the floor tiles clean, ingesting the soup, the powder, the secret ingredient, all in a matter of mere seconds. "Get away from there!" Sharon screamed, kicking at the dog. It was far too late. The bowl was completely licked clean. I watched the dog. Mark watched the dog. Sharon stood frozen, a roll of paper towels clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes wide with mounting horror. For a moment, nothing happened. Precious looked up, licking her chops contentedly, wagging her stub of a tail, waiting eagerly for more. Then she sneezed. It started as a sneeze, then quickly became a cough, then a high-pitched wheeze. The dog's legs suddenly stiffened. She fell hard onto her side, kicking the air violently as if she were running rapidly in a dream. Foam, white and pink, bubbled disgustingly from her jowls. Her eyes rolled back into her head, showing only the whites. Sharon dropped to her knees, screaming the dog's name hysterically. She tried desperately to hold the animal, but Precious was thrashing violently, her claws scratching loudly against the linoleum. 1 minute passed. The thrashing slowed. 2 minutes. The wheezing turned into a low gurgle. 3 minutes. The dog went rigid one last time, violently arching her back, and then she went completely limp. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Precious lay dead on the kitchen floor, her tongue lolling out amidst the shards of the broken bowl. I looked at the dead animal. Then I looked slowly up at my son. "What happened to the dog, Mark?" I asked, my voice trembling with a fear that I didn't have to fake. "Why did she die?" Mark stared blankly at the dog, his face draining of color until he looked like a corpse himself. He looked at the empty packet peeking out of Sharon's apron pocket, then back at the dead animal. He swallowed hard, visibly struggling. "She had a cold," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She was sick. It was just a seizure, Dad. Just a cold." He lied. I knew he lied. And looking directly into his terrified eyes, I knew he knew that soup wasn't meant to help me sleep. It wasn't meant to make me compliant for a doctor. It was meant to permanently stop my heart. The sun rose gray and sickly over the city, perfectly matching the dreadful feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had survived the night by pushing a heavy dresser in front of my bedroom door and sleeping with one eye open, my hand under the pillow gripping the cold steel of my revolver. But morning brought an entirely new danger. Mark violently banged on my door at 7 o'clock sharp. His voice was tight with a forced, manic cheerfulness that sounded exactly like a violin string about to snap. "Get dressed, Dad," he shouted through the wood. "We have that critical appointment." I moved the dresser slowly, purposefully making enough noise to sound like an old man struggling immensely. I opened the door and saw him. He looked even worse than I did. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled faintly of mints, trying desperately to mask the heavy scent of last night's whiskey. He quickly ushered me out to his car, a leased luxury sedan that was 2 months behind on its payments. I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, clutching my cane, watching the familiar streets of my old neighborhood fade away. I expected us to turn toward the city center, toward the official hospital district where the real, legitimate doctors practiced. But Mark turned sharply left, heading instead toward the industrial park, toward the part of town where the streetlights were broken and the storefronts were boarded up with plywood. "Where are we going, son?" I asked, my voice trembling just the right amount. "The hospital is the other way." Mark gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked in protest. "We are going to a specialist, Dad," he said, his eyes fixed rigidly on the road. "A private practitioner. He is the absolute best. He will get you that competency certificate in no time at all." I looked out the window at the graffiti-stained walls and the piles of discarded trash on the curb. A specialist. Sure. A specialist in back-alley procedures and no-questions-asked stitching. We pulled up to a squat brick building that looked like it had been officially condemned 10 years ago. There was no sign, just a heavy metal door with peeling green paint. Mark hurried me out of the car, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he expected the police to be following us. We walked inside. The small waiting room smelled overwhelmingly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. There were no magazines. There was no receptionist. Just a single flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying fly. A door opened, and a man stepped out. He was wearing a white coat, but it was visibly stained yellow at the cuffs. He was short, balding, and sweating profusely despite the chill in the room. I instantly recognized him, not as a doctor, but from the photos Vance had shown me. This was Doc Miller, a disgraced veterinarian who had lost his license years ago for selling animal tranquilizers to local dealers. He was Mark's regular poker buddy. "Ah, Mr. Kingston," Miller said, wiping his damp hands nervously on his coat. "Please come in. We have everything ready for you." I shuffled into the tiny examination room. It was filthy. The exam table was covered in a sheet that looked like it hadn't been changed in a week. There were no diplomas on the wall, just a calendar from an auto parts store. "Sit down," Miller instructed, gesturing toward the table. Mark stood firmly by the door, completely blocking the exit, his arms crossed. I sat down. The paper crinkled loudly under my weight. Miller moved to a nearby metal tray. I saw a syringe. It was already filled with a clear liquid. It was a large dose, far too large for a simple vitamin B shot. Too large for anything meant to heal. I watched him tap the barrel, flicking the air bubbles to the top. The liquid swirled, viscous and deadly. "What exactly is that?" I asked, my eyes wide with feigned fear. "Just a vitamin cocktail," Miller said, his voice shaking slightly. "It will perk you up, get your blood flowing quickly for the lawyer. It helps immensely with memory." Mark nodded grimly from the doorway. "Take it, Dad. It is strictly for your own good." I looked at the needle. Then I looked at Miller. I saw the tremors in his hands. I saw the way he nervously licked his lips. He was terrified. He wasn't a professional killer. He was simply a desperate man doing a terrifying favor for a desperate friend. But a needle in the arm is just as deadly as a bullet in the brain. That liquid wasn't vitamins. It was likely a cocktail of concentrated adrenaline and digitalis, enough to simulate a massive heart attack in an old man with high blood pressure. It was the backup plan. Since the dog ate the poisoned soup, they decided to inject the poison directly. Miller approached me, the needle raised. "Roll up your sleeve, Mr. Kingston," he said. I looked at Mark. He was watching with a hunger that made my skin crawl. He wanted this over. He wanted his inheritance. I slowly began to unbutton my cuff. My movements were agonizingly slow. Miller shifted his weight impatiently. Come on," he muttered under his breath. I pulled my sleeve up, exposing the thin skin of my inner arm. Miller leaned in close. He smelled strongly of fear and antiseptic. He grabbed my arm firmly to steady it. I let him find the vein. I let the tip of the needle hover mere millimeters from my skin. Then, I moved, not with wild violence but with terrifying intimacy. I leaned forward until my face was inches from his ear. I gripped his wrist with my free hand. My grip was not the grip of a frail old man. It was the grip of a man who had moved heavy crates for 40 years. Miller instantly froze, his eyes widening in panic as they met mine. "Doc?" I whispered, my voice low and steady, completely devoid of the senile tremor I had been faking. "Before you push that plunger, you should know something. I sent a GPS pin to my fishing buddy about 20 minutes ago. He gets worried when I go to bad neighborhoods." Miller frowned, visibly confused. "Your fishing buddy?" he squeaked. "Yes," I said, tightening my grip on his wrist until I felt his bones grind slightly. "His name is Sheriff Patterson. He is on his way here right now to have a cup of coffee with us, and he is bringing the drug dogs." The color drained from Miller's face so fast I thought he might actually faint. The needle slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the metal tray. He violently jerked his arm back, breaking my hold, and stumbled away from me, crashing heavily into a cabinet of glass jars. "The sheriff?" he squeaked. "You called the sheriff?" He turned desperately to Mark, his eyes bulging. "You said he was senile. You said he didn't know what day it was." "He knows the sheriff, Mark. You brought a man who is friends with the cops to my clinic. Are you trying to get me killed?" Mark looked from me to Miller, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "He is lying," he shouted. "He doesn't know how to use a smartphone. I took it from him." I smiled. Cold, hard, genuine smile. "I have more than one phone, son." Miller grabbed Mark by the lapels of his jacket and shoved him forcefully toward the door. "Get out!" he screamed. "Get him out of here right now. I am not going to jail for you. Take your dad and your debts and get out before the cops show up." He opened the back door of the clinic and practically threw us out into the garbage-strewn alleyway. "Get out!" he yelled again, slamming the heavy metal door and locking it with a resounding thunk. We were left standing in the filthy alley. Mark looked at me, and for the very first time he saw something other than a victim. He saw a threat, but he was too deep in his own delusion to see the whole terrifying picture. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep with bruising force. He dragged me roughly toward the car, his breathing ragged and heavy. He threw me into the passenger seat and slammed the door so hard the car shook. He stomped around to the driver's side and got in, hitting the steering wheel with his fists repeatedly. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. He screamed a wordless sound of pure, unadulterated frustration. Then he turned to me. His face was twisted, his eyes burning with a deep-seated hatred that had no bottom. "Fine," he hissed, starting the engine and peeling furiously out of the alley. "You want to play games, old man. You want to be difficult. We tried to do this the easy way. We tried to be nice, but you leave me no choice. Tonight you sign those papers. I do not care if I have to break every single finger on your hand to make you hold the pen. We are doing this the hard way." We drove back to my house in a silence that felt heavier than the humid air outside. Mark drove with his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if he expected the sheriff to materialize out of the asphalt behind him. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar neighborhood roll by. The oak trees I had planted 30 years ago, the mailboxes I knew by name. We turned the corner onto my street, and my stomach dropped. There, squarely in the middle of my front lawn, driven right into the heart of Clarissa's prize-winning hydrangea bushes, was a sign. It was bright red and aggressively unprofessional. "For sale by owner, cash only." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the driveway. There was a sensible silver station wagon parked there. Standing on the porch was a young white couple holding hands, looking up nervously at the eaves of my home. They looked hopeful. They looked completely innocent. And standing in front of them, completely blocking the door to my sanctuary, was a real estate agent I didn't recognize. No, wait, it wasn't an agent. It was Sharon. She was wearing a floral dress and holding a clipboard, pointing up at the roof and smiling that practiced shark smile. Mark didn't even slow down until we were right on top of them. He swerved violently onto the grass, leaving deep black tire tracks in the green lawn Clarisse had tended so carefully. The profound disrespect took my breath away. They weren't just killing me, they were erasing me. They were selling the very walls that held my memories before my body was even cold. I stepped out of the car, and the humidity hit me, but it was Sharon's voice that made me truly sweat. She was speaking loud and fast, her voice pitching up in that fake sweetness she used when she desperately wanted something. "Oh yes," she was saying. "It has great bones, a real fixer-upper, but full of original charm. We are letting it go for a steal because we need a quick closing." The young husband looked nervously at the peeling paint on the porch railing. "Why is the price so incredibly low?" he asked. "It seems too good to be true." Sharon let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Well, to be honest," she said, leaning in confidentially, "my father-in-law is moving to a specialized memory care facility next week. It is very sad, really. He has become quite unmanageable, dangerous, even. We need the cash urgently to pay for his treatment. We already have a bed waiting for him. We just need a cash deposit today to hand over the keys on Monday." I stood by the car door, trembling, not from age, but from a rage so pure it felt like fire in my veins. She was selling my life. She was selling the room where I held Clarisse when she cried. She was selling the kitchen where we used to dance on Sunday mornings. And she was doing it for a cash deposit she would likely spend on a handbag before the sun went down. The young woman looked sympathetic. "Oh, that is terrible," she said. "We can write a check for $5,000 today. Is that enough to hold it?" Sharon's eyes lit up like neon signs. "That would be perfect," she cooed. "Just make it out to cash. It speeds up the paperwork immensely." I buttoned my cheap suit jacket. I adjusted my tie. I gripped my cane, not for support, but as a weapon of truth. I walked across the lawn, my boots crunching on the grass my son had just ruined. Mark tried desperately to grab my elbow, hissing at me to get inside, but I shook him off with a sudden strength that surprised him. I walked right up to the young couple. I did not look like a senile old man. I looked like a man who had run a warehouse floor for 40 years. I looked them dead in the eye. "Do not write that check, son," I said. my voice booming clearly across the yard. The husband froze, his pen hovering over the checkbook. He looked at me, then at Sharon. "Why not?" he asked, confused. "Because this house is not for sale," I said, my voice steady and hard. "And even if it was, you would not want it. The foundation is eaten through with termites. The whole thing is held up by prayer and cheap paint, and you should know about the kitchen. My son just killed the family dog in there yesterday because it had rabies. The blood is still under the fridge." I pointed directly at Mark with my cane. "He is not grieving. He is meticulously cleaning up a crime scene." The color instantly drained from the young woman's face. She looked at the house as if it were intensely haunted. She grabbed her husband's arm. "We are leaving," she whispered urgently. The husband didn't argue. He shoved the checkbook into his pocket, and they ran for their station wagon. They peeled out of the driveway even faster than Mark had pulled in. Sharon screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of pure fury. She flew off the porch, her carefully constructed mask completely shattering. "You ruined it!" she shrieked. Her fingers curled into claws. "You ruin everything. You useless old leech." She lunged at me, scratching savagely at my face, drawing blood on my cheek. Mark stepped in and slapped her hard. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Shut up," he yelled. "Get inside before the neighbors call the cops." He grabbed the front of my shirt and pulled me close, his breath hot and reeking of fear. "You pushed me too far, old man," he hissed. "The games are over tonight. You sign those papers, or you are going to meet Mom a lot sooner than you planned." The sun went down, but the heat stayed trapped inside the house like a fever. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of cheap whiskey and fear. Mark didn't bother locking me in the bedroom anymore. He sat in the middle of the living room in my favorite armchair, the one Sharon hadn't destroyed yet. On his lap lay a 12-gauge shotgun. It was old, rusted at the barrel, something he'd picked up at a pawn shop years ago for hunting trips he never took. He was cleaning it, running an oily rag over the stock with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of metal on cloth was the only noise in the room, a rhythmic whisper of violence. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the wall, his eyes glazed and distant. He had stopped pretending. The mask of the grieving son, the concerned caregiver, it was all gone. What was left was a man pushed into a corner. A man who saw no way out but through me. I sat on the edge of my bed in the darkened room down the hall. The door was open a crack, just enough to see the sliver of light from the hallway. I could hear Sharon moving around in the dining room. The sound of packing tape being ripped from the roll was sharp and loud in the quiet house. Ripped smooth. Ripped smooth. She was packing. Not clothes, not memories. She was packing the silver. She was taking down the oil paintings Clarice had collected over 30 years. She was wrapping the flat-screen TV in bubble wrap. I heard her muttering to herself, a low stream of curses and frantic calculations. She wasn't planning on sticking around to care for a senile father-in-law. She was liquidating. She was getting ready to run the moment the money hit the account. She would leave Mark to deal with the mess, to deal with the inevitable body. I knew her type. She was a survivor, a parasite who would detach and find a new host the moment the current one dried up. She didn't care about Mark. She didn't care about the debt. She just wanted her cut before the ship went down. The phone rang. It wasn't the house phone. It was Mark's cell, sitting on the coffee table next to a half-empty bottle of bourbon. The ringtone was loud, jarring in the tense silence. Mark didn't answer it right away. He let it ring 1, 2, 3 times. Then he picked it up, his hand shaking slightly. He put it on speaker, maybe out of habit, maybe because he wanted me to hear, to know why he was about to do what he was about to do. "Rico," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, I just need a few more hours." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and terrifying. "Mark," the voice said, "you are out of hours. My associates are on their way. They have instructions. If the money is not in the account by 9 a.m., they start with your knees. Then they move up. Do you understand?" The line went dead. Mark stared at the phone. He took a long pull from the bottle, the amber liquid spilling down his chin. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild. He stood up, the shotgun clutched in his hand. He swayed slightly, the alcohol and the terror mixing into a dangerous cocktail. He looked down the hall right at my door. I heard his footsteps, heavy and uneven on the floorboards. He was coming. I reached under the mattress, my fingers brushing the cold steel of my own revolver. But I didn't pull it out. Not yet. I needed him close. I needed him to commit. The door to my room burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that cracked the plaster. Mark stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hall light. He looked like a monster from a child's nightmare. In one hand, he held the shotgun, the barrel pointed directly at my chest. In the other, he crumpled a piece of paper. It was the power of attorney form, the one Scott Gold had left. "Sign it!" he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Sign it now, old man, or I swear to God I will paint this room with your brains." The barrel of the shotgun looked like a tunnel into the afterlife. It was dark and smelled of gun oil and old rust. I stared right down the center of it. I did not blink. I did not look away. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. It was the rhythm of a man who had made his peace with death a long time ago in a jungle far away from here. Mark was shaking. The tremors started in his hands and worked their way up his arms until his whole body was vibrating with a mixture of bourbon and adrenaline. He looked pathetic. He looked dangerous. He looked like a stranger wearing my son's face. The paper crinkled in his fist. "Sign it!" he screamed again. "Sign the paper and I will let you live. I will put you in a home. You will be safe. Just sign the damn paper." I looked from the gun to his eyes. They were bloodshot, swimming in tears and rage. He was breaking apart at the seams. I knew I had to push him. I needed him to say it. I needed the recording device hidden under the floorboard to catch every syllable of his sin. I leaned back slightly on the mattress, resting my weight on my elbows. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning a hole in my soul for 3 days. Why did you kill your mother, Mark? Why did you murder the woman who gave you life? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Mark flinched, as if I had physically slapped him. The shotgun dipped for a second, then snapped back up. "Shut up," he hissed. "You do not know what you are talking about." "I know about the pills," I said, my voice calm and low. "I know you switched them. I know you watched her die. Why, son? Was the money worth it?" Mark let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. He lowered the gun, slightly, pacing the small room like a caged tiger. "You want to know why?" he shouted. "You really want to know? Because she was a miser. She was sitting on millions, Dad. Millions. And she watched me drown. She watched me struggle to pay my lease. She watched me borrow from Rico. She knew I was in debt. She knew I was scared. And what did she do? She lectured me. She told me I needed to be responsible. She told me she was cutting me off." He stopped pacing and pointed the gun at my face again. His expression was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "She found out about the gambling. She found my ledger. She said she was going to change the trust. She said she was going to leave it all to charity. Can you believe that? She was going to give my inheritance to strangers while her own son was getting his knees broken by loan sharks. She was selfish, Dad. She was cruel. She forced my hand." He took a swig from the bottle of bourbon he had dragged in with him, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. "I didn't want to hurt her," he slurred. The alcohol was loosening his tongue, just as Thorne and Vance had hoped. "I just needed time. I needed the money now. It was easy. She was old. Her heart was weak. All I did was give her a little push. I switched the beta blockers for the stimulants. It wasn't poison. It was just medicine. If she had been stronger, she would have survived. It is her fault she was weak. It is her fault she was stingy. She forced my hand. She made me do it. I listened to every word. I etched them into my memory." He was blaming her. He was blaming the victim for his own crime. He was a coward, a greedy, entitled coward who thought the world owed him a living. He didn't see a mother. He saw a bank account. He didn't see a murder. He saw a transaction. He threw the paper onto the bed next to me. He tossed a cheap ballpoint pen down beside it. "Enough talking," he growled. "I am done explaining myself to you. Rico is coming at 9 o'clock. I need this signed and notarized by my guy before he gets here. Sign it, old man. Sign it, or I swear I will pull this trigger and tell the police it was a suicide. I will tell them you couldn't live without Mom. It will be poetic." I looked at the paper. It was the power of attorney document, giving Mark full control over all my assets and future assets. It was the key to the kingdom he thought he had won. I looked at the pen. It was a blue bic bitten at the cap. I reached out and picked it up. My hand did not shake. I felt a strange sense of cold calm wash over me. This was it, the final move. I sat up slowly, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed. Mark took a step back, keeping the gun leveled at my chest. "That is it," he said, his voice trembling with anticipation. "Just sign the line at the bottom. Then it is all over." I placed the paper on the nightstand. I smoothed out the wrinkles he had made. I clicked the pen. I looked up at him one last time. I wanted to remember this moment. I wanted to remember the look of triumph in his eyes before I destroyed him. I did not sign my name. I did not write Robert Kingston. I pressed the tip of the pen into the paper hard enough to tear the fiber. I wrote in big block letters. I wrote 4 words. "I know what you did." I put the pen down. I picked up the paper. I held it up so he could see it. Mark squinted in the dim light. He leaned forward, lowering the shotgun slightly. He read the words. His lips moved silently, forming the shapes. "I know what you did." He froze. The triumph vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of absolute confusion and then dawning horror. He looked at the paper, then at my eyes. He saw the soldier there. He saw the man who had hunted him. He realized in that split second that I wasn't senile. I wasn't confused. I wasn't a victim. He realized he had just confessed to a sane man, a man who had the proof. A guttural roar of rage erupted from his throat. He raised the shotgun, aiming it directly at my head. His finger tightened on the trigger. The metal clicked as he took up the slack. I stared into the black hole of the barrel, and I did not blink. Then the world exploded. There was a deafening crash from the front of the house, the sound of heavy wood splintering and metal hinges tearing violently from the frame. It sounded exactly like a bomb going off. The front door had been brutally breached. Mark flinched, his head snapping toward the hallway. Beams of blinding white light cut sharply through the darkness of the house, slicing into the bedroom like lasers. A voice, heavily amplified by a megaphone, boomed through the shattered doorway, shaking the very walls. "Police! Drop the weapon. Drop it now. We have the house completely surrounded." Mark looked back at me, his eyes wide with the sudden, crushing realization that his time had finally run out. But he didn't drop the gun. He panicked. He grabbed me tightly by the collar of my shirt and hauled me up, instantly using my body as a shield against the inevitable justice rushing down the hall. The room exploded again with light that was brighter than the sun. And it wasn't just the hallway anymore, because beams of concentrated light cut through the bedroom windows, shattering the glass with the sheer intensity of the sound waves from the megaphone. "This is the police. We have the house surrounded. Drop the weapon and come out with your hands up." The voice was godlike, shaking the floorboards and rattling the pictures on the walls. I saw the dust motes dancing frantically in the beams of light, like spirits disturbed from their rest. Mark flinched, his grip on my shirt tightening until I thought the cheap fabric would tear right off my back. He looked around wildly, a trapped animal, realizing the cage had no door and the hunter was already inside. The shotgun wavered slightly in his hand, and for a fleeting second, I thought he might drop it. I thought he might surrender and end this nightmare with some shred of dignity. But desperation does strange, terrible things to a man. Turns fear into aggression and panic into violence. He didn't drop the gun. Instead, he screamed a raw, primal sound of denial that tore at his throat. He wasn't ready to give up his inheritance. He wasn't ready to face the consequences of his sins. The light blinded us both, turning the room into a high-contrast nightmare of shadows and glare, and I squinted against the brilliance, my heart pounding a steady war drum in my chest. This was it. The cavalry had arrived, and Thorn had kept his promise. But now I was in the line of fire, and the bullet was already in the chamber. I heard a commotion from the back of the house, a sudden crash and the sound of shouting. It was Sharon. I could picture it perfectly. She had probably grabbed her bag of silver and made a run for the kitchen door the moment the first siren wailed, because she was a survivor, a rat leaving the sinking ship before the water even touched her toes. But she didn't make it far. I heard her scream, a high-pitched shriek of indignation and terror that cut sharply through the noise of the sirens. Then came a voice I recognized, and it wasn't a cop. It was Silas Thorne. "Going somewhere, Mrs. King?" His voice boomed, magnified in the silence between the sirens. "I believe the police have some questions about a poisoned dog and a forged check." She was caught. Thorne had his private security team covering the exits. Mark heard it too. He heard his wife being cornered. He heard his world collapsing around him. He looked at me, and his eyes were void of anything human. They were black pits of panic. He spun me around, slamming my back against his chest, hooking his arm tightly around my neck, cutting off my air. He jammed the barrel of the shotgun against my temple, and the metal was hot now, heated by his feverish grip. "Back off!" he screamed at the empty doorway, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I will kill him. I swear I will kill him. Get back or I blow his head off." He dragged me into the hallway, using my body as a shield, my feet dragging on the carpet. I smelled his sweat, acid and sour. I felt his heart hammering frantically against my back, a frantic, erratic rhythm. He was strong with the strength of the insane, pushing me toward the living room, toward the lights, thinking he could bargain his way out of a murder charge. "I want a car," he yelled at the windows. "I want a clear path or the old man dies." He forgot who he was holding. He forgot that before I was a warehouse manager, before I was a husband, I was a sergeant in a platoon that saw things no man should see. He thought he held a frail old man. He thought he held a victim. He was wrong. We stepped into the blinding white light of the living room, and the glare hit Mark full in the face. He blinked momentarily, disoriented, his grip loosening just a fraction as he tried to shield his eyes from the assault. That was the mistake. That was the opening I had been waiting for. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just reacted. Muscle memory buried under 40 years of peace surged to the surface, instant and lethal. I dropped my weight, suddenly making myself heavy as lead. As he stumbled forward to compensate, I drove my right elbow back with every ounce of strength I possessed. It connected perfectly with his solar plexus, a solid, sickening impact of meat on bone. I felt the air leave his lungs in a wet whoosh. He doubled over, the shotgun barrel dipping toward the floor. I spun around, grabbing the barrel with my left hand and his wrist with my right. I twisted with a violent torque. A sharp snap echoed as his finger broke inside the trigger guard. He screamed in pain. I ripped the weapon from his hands and swept his legs out from under him with a kick that would have shattered a younger man's knee. He hit the floor hard. The wind knocked completely out of him. Mark lay on the floor, gasping desperately for air, clutching his broken hand, his face a mask of agony and shock. I stood over him. The shotgun felt natural in my hands, heavy and familiar, like an old friend returned. I pumped the action, ejecting a shell that spun through the air in slow motion and clattered onto the hardwood. I leveled the barrel at his forehead. He looked up at me, and for the first time he saw the truth. He saw the father who had protected him and the soldier who could end him. I tightened my finger on the trigger. The rage was a roaring fire demanding blood. Then the front door burst inward with a shower of splinters. Men in tactical gear swarmed the room, weapons raised. "Mr. Kingston, don't shoot!" a voice shouted. "Drop the weapon. Mr. Kingston, do not do it." The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed with a low electric buzz that drilled into my skull. but it was nothing compared to the silence on the other side of the thick glass. I sat in the observation room, my hands resting on my cane, watching my son through the one-way mirror. Mark was handcuffed to the metal table. His right hand was splinted and heavily bandaged where I had broken his finger, a stark white reminder of our struggle. He looked small in that chair. The expensive suit was rumpled and stained with sweat and dust. He was leaning forward, speaking to the detective with a frantic energy born of desperation. I could hear every word through the speaker system. He was admitting to the assault. He admitted to threatening me with the shotgun. He called it a breakdown. He called it a moment of grief-induced insanity. But when the detective asked about Clarice, he shut down completely. He shook his head violently, denying everything. "My mother died of a heart attack," he insisted, his voice rising in pitch. "She was old. Her heart was weak. I loved her. I would never hurt her. You have nothing on me for that. Nothing." I watched him lie. I watched the boy I had raised, the man I had protected, twist the truth until it snapped. He thought he was smart. He thought that without a body, without a weapon, he could talk his way out of a murder charge. He thought the threats in the house were just words against words. He didn't know about the floorboard. He didn't know about the relic of a bygone era that had been silently recording his every breath. The door to the interrogation room opened, and the air in the observation booth seemed to get colder. Scott Gold walked in. He didn't look like a lawyer in that moment. He looked like an executioner in a three-piece suit. He carried no briefcase. He held no files. In his hand, he carried a single object, my old Nokia brick phone. It was scratched and worn, a relic from a time when phones were tools, not toys. Mark looked up at him, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I want my lawyer." Gold didn't answer. He didn't sit down. He walked to the table and placed the phone in the exact center of the metal surface. The device looked out of place, like a stone on a dinner plate. Gold pressed a button. The screen glowed a dull green. He looked at Mark, and for the first time, I saw raw fear flicker in my son's eyes, a primal understanding that the trap had snapped shut. Gold pressed play. The audio was tinny but crystal clear in the acoustically tiled room. My voice came through first, calm and steady, asking the question that had started it all. "Why did you kill your mother, Mark? Why did you murder the woman who gave you life?" Then came the silence. And then Mark's voice filled the room. It was the voice of the man in the bedroom, the voice of the monster. "Because she was a miser. She was sitting on millions, Dad." She forced my hand. I switched the beta blockers for the stimulants. It wasn't poison. It was just medicine. If she had been stronger, she would have survived. Mark stopped breathing. He stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. The color drained from his face, leaving him gray and ashen. The recording continued, playing his justification, his blame, his full confession. Every word was a nail in his coffin. He slumped back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He looked at the mirror. He looked right at where I was sitting. He couldn't see me, but he knew I was there. He knew I had played him. He knew that the senile old man he had tried to rob had been 2 steps ahead of him the entire time. Gold stopped the recording. He didn't say a word. He just picked up the phone, turned around, and walked out of the room, leaving Mark alone with the echo of his own sins. My son put his head on the table and began to sob. It wasn't the crying of a remorseful man. It was the weeping of a man who realized his life was over. The door to the observation room opened, and Detective Johnson stepped in. He looked tired but satisfied. He held a file in his hand. He nodded toward the glass where Mark was now rocking back and forth. "We have him, Mr. Kingston," he said quietly. "That recording is admissible. Proves premeditation. Proves motive. But that is not all." He opened the file and laid a transcript on the console in front of me. "We have been questioning your daughter-in-law in the next room. She didn't hold up as well as he did. The moment we told her we had the recording of Mark, she cracked. She is singing like a canary to save her own skin. She confessed to everything, Mr. Kingston. She admitted to opening the credit cards in your name. She admitted to the identity theft. She admitted to poisoning the dog to test the powder. And most importantly, she gave a sworn statement that she witnessed Mark throwing away the real heart medication and replacing it with the stimulants. She said he bragged about it. She said he called it the perfect crime. I looked down at the transcript. Sharon's words were there in black and white, confirming every horror I had suspected. She was throwing him to the wolves to get a plea deal. There was no loyalty among thieves. There was no love in that house, just greed and survival. I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest. It was the finality of it. My family was gone. My wife was murdered. My son was a killer. My daughter-in-law was an accomplice. I was the last one standing in the ruins of the Kingston legacy. Detective Johnson cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He closed the file and looked me in the eye. "There is one more thing, Mr. Kingston," he said, his voice grave. "The recording and the testimony are strong. But to secure a conviction for first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt, we need physical evidence. We need to prove that the stimulants were in her system. We need to prove that it wasn't a natural heart attack." I knew what was coming. I had known it since the moment Thorne showed me the photos. But hearing it out loud didn't make it any easier. "We need to exhume Clarice's body," Johnson said softly. "We need to run a toxicology screen. I know this is asking a lot. I know you just buried her. But we need your permission to bring her back up." I looked through the glass at my son. He was broken, defeated, but he was still alive. Clarice was in the cold ground because of him. She didn't get to say goodbye. She didn't get to see Paris. She died scared and betrayed in her own kitchen. If bringing her up meant keeping him down, then it was what I had to do. I gripped my cane. I thought of the woman who had stood by me for 50 years. I thought of the justice she deserved. "Do it," I said, my voice hard as stone. "Dig her up, find the poison, and bury him with it." The morning they dug up my wife, the sky was the color of a bruise. I stood at the edge of the cemetery plot, leaning heavily on my cane while the heavy machinery roared. It was a profane sound, a large backhoe tearing violently into the earth where I had laid her to rest only a week before. Every scoop of dirt felt like a physical blow to my own body. I had spent 50 years protecting Clarice. I walked on the sidewalk side of the street. I checked the locks at night. I made sure her car had oil. My one job was to keep her safe, and I had failed. I let a wolf live in our house, and now I was failing her again by disturbing her final piece. I watched the metal teeth of the bucket bite into the soil, and I had to close my eyes. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Silas Thorne. He sat in his wheelchair beside me, his face pale, but his eyes steady. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me it was going to be okay. He just sat there bearing silent witness to the horror because he loved her, too. We waited patiently in the cold morning air until the casket was finally raised. It looked wrong in the harsh light of day, muddy and scarred. They loaded it into a white van without ceremony. I followed that van to the medical examiner's office, driving my truck with a numbness that spread from my fingers to my heart. We sat in a sterile waiting room that smelled strongly of floor wax and formaldehyde. The hours dragged by like years. I stared intensely at a crack in the linoleum floor, trying desperately not to imagine what was happening behind the double doors. I tried not to think about the scalpel. I tried not to think about my Clarice being cut open again. Thorne read a newspaper, but he never turned the page. We were two old men keeping a difficult vigil for a woman who deserved far better than this. I thought about Mark sitting in a holding cell. I hoped he was cold. I hoped he was scared. I hoped he knew that with every second the clock ticked, the noose was getting tighter. Detective Johnson pushed open the double doors at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He held a clipboard against his chest, and his face was grim. He did not look like a man who had good news, but he looked like a man who finally had answers. He sat down opposite us and placed a clear plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside was a printout of a toxicology graph. The lines spiked high and sharp, red peaks on a white grid. "We have the results," Johnson said, his voice low and professional. The medical examiner found massive concentrations of ephedrine and caffeine in her blood work, along with traces of a synthetic amphetamine usually found in diet pills from the 1990s. It was not a natural heart attack, Mr. Kingston. Her heart didn't fail. It was exploded. He explained that the dosage was 10 times the safe limit for a healthy adult. For a woman with her condition, it was a death sentence within an hour of ingestion. I looked at the graph. It was just ink on paper, but it represented the exact moment my wife died. I could see it. I could see her taking her morning pills, trusting they would keep her alive. I could see her feeling the racing pulse, the panic, the tightness in her chest. I could see her reaching for the phone that Mark had likely unplugged. Johnson tapped the paper. "We ran a comparison against the residue found in the vial your investigator pulled from the trash. It is a match, a perfect chemical match. We also found traces of the same substance in the upholstery of your son's car. He must have spilled some when he was mixing it. It is conclusive. We have the weapon. We have the opportunity. We have the motive. And thanks to your recording, we have the confession." The numbness in my body evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard weight of finality. It was real. It wasn't a suspicion. It wasn't a nightmare. My son murdered my wife. He poisoned her. He watched her die. And he did it for money he owed to thugs. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. Just one. I wiped it away angrily. I looked at Thorne. He nodded slowly. His eyes were wet, too. "We got him, Robert," he whispered. "We got the bastard." By 5 o'clock, the district attorney had filed the paperwork. The charges were read out loud in the precinct briefing room, and I listened to every word. Mark Kingston was charged with murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, grand larceny, and fraud. The list went on, a litany of sins that would bury him for the rest of his natural life. Sharon was charged as an accessory to murder, conspiracy, and fraud. The judge denied bail immediately. They were deemed flight risks. They were deemed dangers to society. They were remanded to the county jail until trial. I saw them on the news that evening. They were doing the perp walk. Mark was wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with his pale, terrified skin. He looked at the cameras, and for a second he looked right at me through the screen. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked like a child who realized the dark was real. Sharon was crying, hiding her face with her hands. Her hair was a mess. Her designer life was over. They were going to die in prison. It was justice. But it didn't bring Clarice back. It didn't fill the empty side of the bed. It just closed the book on the ugliest chapter of my life. I sat in the waiting room of the station feeling hollow. The adrenaline was gone, leaving me emptied out. I was an old man with no wife and no son. I was alone. Scott Gold walked in. He looked fresh despite the long day. He carried a thick manila envelope under his arm. He sat down next to me. "Mr. Kingston," he said softly, "the legal matter of the criminal case is now in the hands of the state. But there is still the matter of the estate." I looked at him wearily. "I don't care about the money, Scott. Burn it. Give it away. I don't want a dime of the money that killed her." Gold shook his head. "You need to see this." He opened the envelope and pulled out a document bonded in blue paper. The will we showed Mark was a draft. It was a decoy designed to flush him out. Clarice wrote another one. Final one. She wrote it the day she hired the investigator. She knew Robert. She knew it might come to this. She left instructions that were only to be revealed once the threat was neutralized. He placed the document in my hands. It was heavy. "Read it, Robert. Read what she really wanted." I opened the blue legal folder Scott Gold placed in my hands, and the paper inside felt heavier than a Bible. The first page was a handwritten letter on the creamy stationery Clarice kept in her vanity drawer for special occasions. I traced the ink with my thumb. "My dearest Robert," she wrote, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it likely means I did not go peacefully. I have kept secrets from you, my love. Not because I did not trust you, but because I wanted to protect you. I wanted you to live a simple life, a life without the burden of wealth and the vultures it attracts. But I failed, Robert. I failed because the vulture was already in our nest. I have watched our son, Mark, change over the years. I watched him turn from a sweet boy into a man consumed by envy and greed. I saw the way he looked at us, not with love, but with calculation. I found his gambling slips. I found the forged checks. The fruit has rotted on the vine, Robert, and I fear the rot has reached the core. I hid the money to keep him from destroying himself, but now I fear he will destroy us to get to it. If I die under suspicious circumstances, do not trust him. Do not mourn me yet. Go to Silas Thorne. He holds the key to everything. He is the only one I trust to help you navigate the storm that will follow my death. I love you, Robert. You were my soldier in life, and I know you will be my soldier after I am gone. Fight for us. Fight for the truth. I lowered the letter. She knew. She had lived in terror in her own home, watching her son turn into a monster, and she had faced it with a quiet dignity that broke my heart. She had prepared for her own murder because she knew Mark better than I did. She knew he was capable of the unthinkable. Gold turned the page to the formal legal document. This is the last will and testament of Clarice Kingston. It supersedes all previous documents, including the draft we showed your son. Article 1, regarding the disposition of assets to immediate family. To my son, Mark Kingston, I leave the sum of $1 US. I stared at the document. $1. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. Leaving him $1 meant she remembered him, she considered him, and she decided that was exactly what he was worth. It was a final slap in the face from the grave. A message that she saw him for exactly what he was. Article 2, Gold continued. To my daughter-in-law, Sharon King, I leave absolutely nothing. I leave her with the knowledge that her greed yielded no reward. Article 3, regarding the residuary estate. To my husband, Robert Kingston, I leave the entirety of my estate, real and personal. This includes the primary residence on Elm Street, the contents of all safety deposit boxes, the investment portfolio managed by Thorne Industries, and the liquid assets held in the offshore trust, totaling $3,200,000. $3 million. The money didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like blood money. It felt like the price of my wife's life. Mr. Kingston, Gold said, pulling me out of my thoughts. The assets are yours. They are already transferred to your name. You can do whatever you wish with them. You can buy a yacht. You can burn it. It is yours. I stood up and walked to the window of the police station. Outside, the city was moving on. People were walking their dogs, driving to work, living lives that hadn't been shattered by betrayal. I thought about the house on Elm Street. I thought about the kitchen where Precious died. I thought about the bedroom where Mark held a shotgun to my head. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. Couldn't go back there. Sell it, I said without turning around. Sell the house. I do not care what you get for it. Just get rid of it. I never want to step foot inside that place again. Sell the furniture. Sell the car. Sell everything that reminds me of them. And the money? Gold asked. What do you want to do with the $3 million? I turned to face him. I thought about the thousands of other old folks sitting in their paid-off houses, afraid of their own children. I thought about the people who didn't have a Silas Thorne to watch their backs. I don't want it, I said firmly. I have my pension. I have my truck. That is enough for me. But I am not going to burn it. Clarice worked too hard for it. She earned every penny. We are going to use it to fight back. I want to start a foundation, Scott. The Clarice Kingston Foundation. I want to hire lawyers for elderly people who are being abused by their families. I want to hire private investigators to expose the greedy children waiting for their inheritance. I want to pay for safe housing for seniors who need to escape. I want every dime of that $3 million to be used to stop people like Mark. Gold smiled. That is a noble legacy, Mr. Kingston. Clarice would be proud. I will draw up the paperwork immediately. I left the station with the folder under my arm. I had one last thing to do. I got into my truck and drove toward the state correctional facility. I sat in the visitation booth on the secure side of the glass. 5 minutes later, the door on the other side opened. Mark was wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. He had lost 20 pounds. His eyes were hollow. He sat down and picked up the receiver, his hand shaking. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Dad, you came." I picked up the phone. "I came to give you something," I said. I held up the blue folder. I pressed the page against the glass. "Read it, Mark. Article 1. He squinted. He read the line. "To my son, Mark Kingston. I leave the sum of $1. He started to cry. He pressed his forehead against the glass. "Dad, please," he begged. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. Please help me. I am scared." I watched him cry. I felt nothing. I stood up. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single crisp $1 bill. I slid it through the slot in the metal tray. "Here is your inheritance, son," I said. "Don't spend it all in one place." I hung up the phone. I turned my back on his weeping face. I walked out of the prison and into the cool night air. I took a deep breath. For the first time in months, my lungs filled completely. I was alone, but I was free. 1 year later, the air tasted of roasted chestnuts and expensive perfume. I stood on the deck of a private riverboat on the Seine. I was 76 years old, but I felt younger than I had at 50. I was wearing a bespoke navy suit tailored in London. My shoes were Italian leather. My cane was made of polished ebony with a silver handle. I looked like a man who owned the world, or at least a significant part of it. Paris. Clarice had talked about Paris for 50 years. She never made it. I looked out at the architecture, the bridges, the lovers walking hand in hand. I wasn't just seeing it for me. I was seeing it for us. The Clarice Kingston Foundation was thriving back home. We had saved 16 seniors from abusive situations in the first 6 months. We had put 3 corrupt guardians in jail. Every victory was a tribute to her. I had turned her tragedy into a crusade. I turned to Silas Thorne, sitting in a comfortable chair nearby. He raised a glass of vintage Bordeaux. He was my brother in arms. We shared the silence of men who knew the cost of peace. "Ready, Robert?" he asked softly. I nodded. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Contained just a handful of ash. The rest of her was resting in a beautiful mausoleum back home. But this part belonged to the world. I walked to the railing. I opened the pouch. I didn't say a prayer. I tilted the pouch. The gray dust caught the wind, swirling for a moment in the golden light before settling onto the surface of the river. "Go see the world, my love," I whispered. "You earned it." I watched until the last speck disappeared. A profound sense of lightness washed over me. The knot of grief finally loosened. She wasn't gone. She was just everywhere. I turned back to Thorne. We touched glasses. "To Clarice," he said. "To Clarice," I replied. "And to justice." I looked up at the sky. I thought of Mark in his cell, staring at a concrete wall. I thought of Sharon working in a diner, trying to pay off her fraud restitution. I thought of the past, but then I let it go. I smiled. It was the smile of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side with his soul intact. "We are free, Clarice," I whispered to the wind. "We are finally free."